Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the December 10th, 2024 Curriculum Subcommittee meeting. We'll start off with approval of minutes from November 25th, subcommittee meeting. I'll move that. Do I have a second? Thank you very much, Jesse. Jesse, how do you vote?
Yes.
And Helen, how do you vote?
Yes.
Stephen?
Yes.
I vote yes as well. Thank you. We are excited. I'm excited to have Emily back here for our presentation on middle school science. So, Emily, I think I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Should I unmute here?
No.
Just everybody.
can hear you.
All right, everyone can hear me.
I should have announced, your sound goes right through here. There are microphones at top of the detail,
Perfect.
so.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. 4:30. All right, and then I'm gonna go into slideshow mode so it's easier to read. So thank you all for taking some time in your busy agenda to have me here today. I am super excited to meet with you and tell you about the work we're doing. I love talking about science and the work that our teachers are doing and that our students are doing around science. Luckily, I'm sitting because I told Jody today that I was running a stream table program at FRR and I had my black pants on and I'm covered in sand. I'm like trying to get it all off before coming to presenting with you guys, but doing science is what I'm passionate about. So I came to curriculum subcommittee several years ago and presented, but it's been a while. So some of these slides are a repeat just because I know we've had some new people come onto the committee and I wanted to have sort of a baseline that was familiar to everybody before we go specifically into kind of the focus work we've been doing with middle school over the last couple of years. We have a department mission that is about having our students prepared to be scientifically literate global citizens and to give them that foundation that they would need if they want to go on to higher education or careers in any of the STEM fields. So science is important for everybody because everyone will be citizens making choices with scientific information. And we also want to make sure every student has a full spectrum of options available to them as they go forward. So we want students to have a deep, enduring understanding of how to think and work like scientists. It's really important that we're doing science, not just knowing facts about science. And we want them to make real world connections to the things that they're experiencing in their life that are about science. And we want them to be lifelong learners, stewards of the environment, and responsible global citizens. So those are some things that we are hoping to achieve with the work that we do in the science department. What we teach comes from kind of a set of different documents. So back in 2012, there was a document called A Framework for K-12 Science Education that was published. And that really was a culmination of several decades of research into what are the major concepts in science, how do we learn them at different developmental points in time, and what do we need students to know at each of those developmental points so that they're prepared for the next one. It's an amazing document if you're a science nerd like me. And what it did was kind of give this whole overview of science. And then there was a collaboration of 26 states that took this information and turned it into a set of performance standards called the Next Generation Science Standards. And you'll see that abbreviation NGSS at other places in the presentation. And what that is a collaborative set of standards that were built to try and get all of those things that the framework said research tells us about what people need to know about science, how they learn science. Massachusetts was in that 26 state collaboration. They helped write NGSS. And then after NGSS was written, some states adopted it full outright, and some states took those standards and modified them. In Massachusetts, we made some modifications from that. So the standards that we are responsible for here in Massachusetts are the Mass STE standards, the science, technology, and engineering standards. They have about an 85–90% overlap with NGSS, but there are certain places in which they are different. So there's curriculum out there that is being written and aligned to NGSS, and we can often use that, but it does take some modification because the set of standards we are responsible for in Massachusetts are very similar, but not exactly the same.
So you're saying NGS, I'm Jesse, by the way, NGSS is like in a subset of it then, or
So
a child of it?
it's different at different places. So in some places, like there's a second grade standard in NGSS that's specifically about plants and pollinators and how they interact. Massachusetts didn't adopt that standard. So we have a different standard in second grade that's a little more general about how plants and animals interact in systems. So there's things like that, and then there's some places where they kept the same standard but like added a word or changed the word. So if you're like a science nerd and you really dig deep into it, I can tell you all of the details of that. But for the general sense is that they're mostly the same, but we do have to modify things that are aligned to NGSS to specifically get at math standards.
Just to quickly interject, that's generally true for any sort of national standards.
Yeah.
The National Social Studies standards aren't quite Massachusetts. The National Language standards aren't quite the Massachusetts.
So, and we're talking about sort of like subjects then. Differences are subjects, like when you talk plant pollinators, it's like a subject area.
Yeah, so when they did the framework, they really kind of thought about these domains of science, life science, physical science, earth science, and then they broke those domains further down into like big subcategories. When we look at the MCAS data, I can kind of show you those. And then from there, specific standards that are specific developmental levels. So this was a change from the math standards that we had had for decades before that. And so in the previous standards and in the MCAS kind of before 2017, our standards really were focusing on content. And most of us grew up in an era when we did science classes that were very content heavy. You need to know these facts, you need to know these laws, you need to know these theories. The new standards actually equally prioritize three different things: science practices, the doing of science; the disciplinary core ideas, that's the content that was there before; and what they call cross-cutting concepts. These are big ideas that tie together fields of science. Ideas like systems. Systems are an organizing principle that you can use in physical science or biological science or earth science. So the new standards are much more what we call three-dimensional, and that's something that you'll hear a lot if you hear people talking about science standards. The previous scientific method, and again, this is probably the way most of us learned it in middle school or high school, was a straight line. You ask a question, you make a hypothesis, you set up a procedure, and we no longer envision science as happening in a linear process. It's not something that you start in one place and you go forward and it has an endpoint, but rather that science in engineering is an iterative process where you start at some point, you learn some things, you come back, you ask new questions. So we're really trying to move to this idea of thinking about there's 8 scientific and engineering practices, and they happen iteratively, and you are using them at different points in time to achieve different things when you have a question or a problem. And the old standards were kind of like, oh, this idea seems like it'll be fun for first graders, or this idea seems like it'll be fun for 8th graders, and just kind of put concepts in where we thought they might be right. Whereas the new progression uses that framework. What we know from research is developmentally appropriate. At what points in time do students develop the abstract skills to learn about a level of scale or distance that is outside of the frame of reference that they are familiar with? Like, all of those things were considered when deciding where standards went. So they were very purposeful. The other thing that's really important in the new way that we're teaching science is that instead of science being focused around a series of topics that you learn in the order that the teacher thinks is the right order, we actually use something called an anchoring phenomena. So we have something about the world we're trying to explain with the science that we are doing. So students will be introduced to a problem or a question or something, what we used to call a discrepant event, something that's not happening like what they expect it to. And the purpose of that is to start having students generate questions and models about what they think are happening. So they'll see this discrepant event, they'll see this phenomena, they'll have a discussion about it, they'll try and they'll think about like what might be happening here, and they'll create an initial model. And those initial models are really a great way for us as educators to see what's going on in the students' heads, where they are developmentally, what ideas are they pulling in. Then we use that model to generate questions about, okay, we think we understand this, but we still don't understand that. What do we need to learn to fully explain this? And those questions then drive our instruction. So we're really, it's a way of shifting student-centered from just like the hands-on, that was early inquiry science education, to really being about like scientists notice things in the world, and then they try to explain them, and then they investigate to learn more. And as they learn more, they refine their understanding of things. It's something that's happened with all sorts of science concepts throughout the history of human scientific endeavor. And we don't recreate all of that scientific endeavor in the classroom, but we recreate that experience for students of getting a phenomena, trying to understand it, trying to figure out what they need to know next, and then using that to build their understanding. And so for those of us who learn science differently, this is one of those shifts both for families and parents. The way in which their child is doing science may look really different or sound really different than the way they learned it themselves in school. And for some of our teachers, it's also really different from what they've done for a really long time. And so we are kind of focusing on how do we help teachers and families understand the purpose and the function of phenomena.
So you're saying that maybe even the whole swath of teachers who teach science with this curriculum need PD or
Yeah.
redirection or alignment to sort of think in this way, so they project that same thought
Yeah,
towards
and
the kids.
we did start, we started with that, even before we did the scope and sequence work that I'll talk about today. We did, in my second year here, we worked with the Museum of Science and did some PD just on like, what is the anchoring phenomena? How do you teach with it? But of course, we continue to get new teachers. And so there's continual need to support new people who may be coming from a place where they didn't get that background.
Right, I guess
So
I
the
bring up,
both and.
I bring up from time to time, like teachers that are coming out of bachelors of science education degrees from colleges, are they learning this? in the
Yes, some of them
science side?
are,
They're
some of
starting
them
to
aren't,
come- it's
depends
starting
a
to
little
be
bit on the program.
Integrated, yeah.
Yeah.
Does it carry over into math as well? This kind of concept of anchor?
So I think that in math, there's a real similarity in the way math talks kind of approach an open-ended problem and really help kids think about like what are their strategies for finding an answer, and this work. So it's not exactly the same process, but the critical thinking skills and the ways in which kids are interacting with something and kind of really first making their own thinking visible, and then from what they understand and know about something, building a deeper and more accurate understanding. I think that process is very similar. Any other questions? If I'm missing any questions from the Zoom.
Hi, this is Stephen over here. Emily, I'm just wondering, does this sounds a little bit like design thinking in that students are asked to respond to a challenge with their own solution, and then they revise and refine. But what's missing is that there's nothing supporting their thought in the first place. Is there any introduction? What was that?
tell me more about what you're.
Oh, okay, what I'm more accustomed to is a design thinking process whereby students are exposed to some scientific learning, say a lesson about airfoils or something like that, or a specific lesson in a concept in physics. And then they're asked to respond to a challenge. And then from there, they develop their hypothesis and they iterate on their solution. So that sounds to me like a traditional kind of design thinking that for me, anchoring phenomena echoes. That's the concept pedagogically that I'm very familiar with. So that's my only reference point. So that it's just I'm responding from a position of some ignorance. So I'm just comparing it to what I know. So I'm listening and wondering at what point in this pedagogical process are they introduced to uh, scientific facts or what is known scientifically? Is it after they begin modeling, or is it before? Do they have a starting point? When in this learning are they introduced to scientific ideas?
That is an awesome question, and a really big part of the art of doing this well is making those calls, which is why having some resources that we'll talk about later on can be very helpful in doing that. So in the beginning, those initial models are not about making an accurate model. It's about getting student thinking visible so we can understand where students are coming from, and we can build on that rather than what we think students might be knowing or understanding about a topic. So in those beginning models, it's really about making student thinking visible, not about demonstrating scientific knowledge. As they start to learn more, we are expecting that their models become more accurate because they are getting information through the different practices. It may be that they are provided with some data that they analyze and they talk about, and then they make claims from that data that help them make a scientifically accurate understanding. One of the science practices is using readings and other media to learn about science. So there are points in time where, like, okay, we've done some investigations and we've looked at some data from this other place, but we need to know a little bit more about what's underlying the mechanisms, and that's when you might bring in a reading. So an example of that in the 8th grade physics unit is that they're trying to figure out why sometimes cell phones break when they fall and sometimes they don't. And early in the unit, they spend some time trying to think about what happens when two things come into contact, and do they change shape, and do they always change shape, and when do they change shape in a way that they don't return? When do they break? And so they learn a little bit about deformation. They do a lab in which they measure deformation of different materials, and then they read about, like, how do engineers understand elastic limit? What is elastic limit? How is that related to what's happening when things collide, right? So they start off from a, like, hey, we've got this question and we're starting to figure it out. They spend some time making models where they're just thinking about, like, what do I know about the world in my experience? And then slowly they do a combination of investigations and readings that get them to a scientific understanding.
So
Thanks.
Carol has a question.
That was a great answer. Wait, can I just a quick follow-up?
Okay.
I would love to know, just nerdily, like any of the education theorists that from which this model is taken.
So
Just for my own benefit, this is not a
I
skeptical.
couldn't give you the names off the top of my head. Where they would be is in the frameworks, and so I can go back to the frameworks and find some of the people who worked on that and some of the references they used there.
Okay, again, I'm not asking out of any skepticism. This is just for my own curiosity.
No, I understand. Yes, and
Okay,
all
thank you.
comes back to the frameworks. That's where, if you're ever really bored and you want to read the frameworks, then it'll actually, if you're a science nerd like me, be really exciting.
Okay,
Carolyn,
thank you.
what's your question? How can I help you?
Thanks. Hi, this is Carolyn Ball. I'm a school committee member. So Stephen's question was, when are students introduced to scientific ideas? And then you, I think, just said sort of the students get to understanding. I'm trying to understand, well, a few things. One is sort of like, how new is this approach? And is all of this, you're talking about the frameworks, and then I think that our district's curriculum is through Open Sci Ed. So I'd be interested in sort of the connection between what you're presenting and that curriculum.
Because I will talk a lot about that when we get to the middle school part. So I might see if I answer your question with that, and then if not, I can come back to it.
So I guess I'm hearing a lot of this sort of like students explore and teach themselves or figure it out. So how much is kind of imparting of facts, which I think is what Stephen said too, or scientific ideas with a teacher teaching?
So I'm going to try and explain again, because I was clearly not as communicating exactly what I meant to say, since what you heard is different from what I meant to say. So in that process that I was just describing for 8th grade, right? There are certain things they are figuring out themselves. They are figuring out and getting data and evidence that things change shape and deform when they come in contact. And they're doing that through a series of hands-on labs and activities and collecting data. They get to a point where they figure that piece out, but they need the next level of knowledge. What is this called? This is an elastic limit. How do scientists define it? And that's at the point where they would get a reading from an expert that takes them to the next level and kind of ties it all together and provides them what we call the stamp on that concept, right? So there is many things that they are figuring out with kind of supported guidance and kind of thoughtful progression that's been field tested in a lot of different places. And then there are also times when they're using the scientific skill of reading and comprehending to get the next level of knowledge, things that we can't necessarily test for or experiment for, things that took decades and decades or hundreds of years for scientists to come up with. We do not have our 6th graders figure out that atoms are atoms, right? That took many decades, but they get to a certain point where they realize they need the concept of atom to explain what they're trying to explain. And then we give them some background reading about how early chemists and alchemists figured out what atoms were. We do some of the work that those scientists do. We didn't do all of it. And then we use that information to say, okay, so the thing that you're trying to explain in this model, that is atoms, and these atoms can form other structures called molecules. And when a chemical reaction happens, what's happening with those atoms and molecules based on the evidence we've seen throughout the universe? We know that the same amount of matter is there at the end as there was at the beginning. So how can we explain that with this idea of atoms?
So I'm gonna, yeah, well, no, probably not. Good effort. I don't mean it's not clear. I actually get it because I'm an educator, but I'm gonna try and move you along.
Okay, so
Because
we've got a lot to go through.
You have about 20 more minutes, unfortunately, in terms of just not. So I'm thinking if we can hold our questions a little bit, so we know how much time we have at the end, and if we can move it along, because we do have this.
Yes, and so I'll finish going through. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Open Sci Ed later, and so hopefully that'll also answer some questions you might have. So the other thing that I wanted to touch on today before I dig into the middle school work is that science doesn't stand by itself. Science intersects with a lot of other areas, and there's 2 other areas that I wanted to highlight today. So science intersects very strongly with all other curricular areas, both kind of like what we think of as the core academics, but also all of the associated arts. There are ways in which the skills that happen in all of the classrooms and all of the other times of the day that support strong science thinking. So it's really important that strong science thinking is built in the context of all areas of the curriculum, because to be a good scientist, you need to be able to read, you need to be able to write, you need to analyze data and know math, you need to be able to make clear diagrams and technical drawings, you need to be able to experience the world and notice difference between different sound patterns, and all of those things help us to be good, strong scientists. So we intersect with all areas of the curriculum, and it's really important that we have a very balanced program so that we can have strong science thinkers. When we work on topics in science, when we work on this developing deep conceptual models, we are also setting students up to have stronger reading comprehension when they get to reading about those topics, right? So if we have spent the time to make sure that our kids have a fully developmental model about a concept, when we give them a reading about that concept, they're going to understand it better, and they're going to be able to hold on to that information longer. So for my continual cry and plea all of the time is that we work as a district, we work together as coordinators to build purposeful and strategic interdisciplinary connections, because the more we build that, the stronger our students' critical thinking skills will be. So that's one area of intersection. Although we are not working specifically on new science at the K-5 level, all of the work that happens at the K-5 level in ELA and social studies will have impact on science, and we want to make sure that we are strategically making those impacts positive. The other thing that I know you guys recently heard from the Sustainability Task Force, and of course, sustainability and science walk hand in hand. So as you saw in our vision, part of our vision of our work is to create the next generation of environmental stewards. That's something that is core to what we try and do with our science curriculum. Both the next gen science standards that we talked about and the maths, science and technology and engineering standards have standards at every grade level K-8 that have some connection to environmentalism, sustainability. So those are also part of our mandate from the state in terms of what we are teaching to our students. And learning about these things, learning about the environment, learning about sustainability, climate science, impacts, mitigation, what we can do, highly engaged students. They're things that students want to know about. They're things that students are excited to learn and make a difference around. So it also is really important to us for engagement. So I just wanted to make sure that we understand that science is super fun and exciting and important to me, and I love it. But science also is part of a bigger picture and a bigger in our district. So I'm going to move right now from kind of this general background about science into our middle school scope and sequence work. So we started the middle school scope and sequence work by setting some criteria for what we wanted the final product to look like. So before we started doing any of that, we had some conversations in the team, and then I kind of synthesized them and came to this agreement that these were the things that we would be looking for in our scope and sequence. We wanted it to be aligned to the math standards, and we are required to have it aligned to the math standards. We wanted something that was consistent so that students that went to any of the K-8 schools in Brookline would have not the same experience, but an experience that was consistent and familiar to other students in other K-8 schools around the district. We needed some flexibility because teaching is as much an art as it is a science. And so we want to have something that allows for consistency and also allows for the flexibility that's needed in a classroom. We wanted room in the curriculum to be creative. We wanted students and teachers to feel like they were creative and able to bring themselves into the classroom. We wanted it to be inclusive and equitable. We wanted it to prepare students for future, both going into the high school and careers beyond that. And we wanted something that support teachers doing their work. So that was what we were trying to design for when we worked on the scope and sequence. We did kind of the first round of work in the school year, the 22-23 school year. And that was kind of thinking about what goes where. And we did an iterative process in grade level teams. We used a tuning protocol to look at different options for scopes and sequences. And then people would provide feedback, and then I would use that feedback to make some adjustments. Just like science is an iterative process, this was an iterative process. During the process, some things that we heard from teachers over and over again was that we wanted a clear storyline connection within a year. We wanted things to make sense as you went through 6th grade from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And we wanted there to be a connection between one year and the next year. And we wanted to think about like what base knowledge do people need at one point to get to the next. We also had teachers who'd been teaching here for a really long time, had a set of topics that they were comfortable with, that they had a lot of resources for. So we wanted to, as much as possible, reduce movement of big topics. But we did need to do some movement because one of the things we had diagnosed was that there used to be, the 6th grade used to be more in the elementary grade. And then when we moved it to middle school, it still had retained a lot of elementary standards. So our 6th graders were not doing middle school level standards. So we had to make some shifts to move some things into 6th grade that were middle school appropriate and move the things that were elementary back into elementary. So we had some shifts that needed to be made, but we tried to reduce those. So at the end of that school year, we came up with this working scope and sequence, and it's really a very working draft, because as we're doing it, we are learning things. The timing on this is still the most, the thing that most needs to be ironed out. But what we did is we put the standards, so these numbers and letters here just represent different scientific standards. So we put the standards into groups. We organized them into big units from 6th grade to 8th grade. Now we are in our 2nd year of an implementation process. We opted for a 3-year implementation. And the reason we did that is because we're actually following a group of students. So the group of students that were 6th graders last year are going to get the new scope and sequence their whole time through. So the students before that are getting whatever was there at that school beforehand. And then this 6th grade group is moving up. So last year, 6th graders, that was our focus grade. So that grade kind of got the most PD and attention, and they followed the new scope and sequence. And they worked collaboratively to use 2 of those Open SciEd units that Caroline mentioned to try and meet the first 2 units of the scope and sequence. And then we did kind of a mix of things for 3rd unit that we're going to refine again this year. 7th grade was following the new scope and sequence. They had very little change actually in their in what they taught and when they taught it. But they weren't using any new curriculum materials except by choice. So some teachers were trying out some units and trying to get a sense of them. And they really worked on breaking down the standards. So UBD is an acronym for Understanding by Design, and it's just a way of taking the standards and breaking them down and thinking about like, what do they mean? What are the things you need to know in order to achieve those standards? What do you need to understand at a big level? So 7th grade kind of looked at their units and started kind of parsing that out. And 8th grade did the same thing. We did have last year in 8th grade several new teachers and a long-term sub who needed to have some resources in front of them. And those teachers did use Open SciEd because we don't have other curriculum materials to provide outside of Open SciEd. And we had an 8th grade teacher who was new 3 years ago who has been using Open SciEd since he started. So that was something we had some of the new teachers do because that was the curriculum resource we had available for them. We're in year 2 right now. This year, 7th grade is our focus. So this year, 7th graders, again, are that group of students that are moving up through that. And so this year, they are working on how do we use Open SciEd as a curriculum tool. And then the what we're working on now, in addition to that, is common assessments. What are some common ways we can assess to get to that consistent part? How can we make sure that as we make the modifications that are needed in each school, we're still staying consistent? And then eighth graders, because we've had some turnover in our eighth grade team, we actually have many teachers who are following the new scope and sequence this year because we decided it didn't make sense for a new teacher to learn us one scope and sequence for 1 year and a different one for the next year. So next year, all the eighth grade students will be, all that focused cohort will go up to eighth grade. And all the eighth grade teachers, veterans and new, will be teaching the new scope and sequence. That team will have some people on it who've been using OpenSciEd because they're new, and some people who are veteran who haven't used it, and we'll work together about how do we use that tool, and we'll continue to refine our common assessments. Common assessments take a while to make. We're not going to get all of them made this year, so we'll probably take another year on that. Sixth grade will really be working. They have done an amazing job. Their common assessment for their chemistry unit, they rewrote it. It's amazing. So they were just talking about that in the meeting before this, and they're going to be able to start looking at student work together and start actually like norming how do we use those assessments and what do they tell us about students' knowledge next year. And seventh grade will be in a similar boat with their assessments.
They're all generated internally?
So there is, yes, the final common assessment for each one will be generated internally. Some of them are going to be based on, like, some of them are based on OpenSciEd assessments that are being refined. Some of them are completely separate from OpenSciEd. It really goes back to our standards in the UBD. So the process of understanding by design. So when the team takes the standards and they break them down, we want our assessments to align to that. So it's not what comes from the curriculum, it's what meets the needs of the standards that determines what we use for common assessment.
And how does that match the like state assessments? I don't know. You know,
So MCAS, MCAS is changing in 5th through 8th. I don't know how much people know about that in
No.
science. I'm gonna try and keep
Okay.
that super brief,
Thanks.
but they are moving from the MCAS that you've known for years, which is multiple choice and some constructed responses, to what they're calling simulation-based testing. So they're going to this year be field testing across the state. Every student who takes the science MCAS will get a field test of a simulation-based question, and simulation-based questions require students to collect data within the test format using a simulation and use that data to answer questions.
Like on a computer or something.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, on a computer. And we have access to some resources that are embedded into our middle school curriculum where students are using simulations like that fairly frequently. I don't think it'll be a big lift for middle school. I think we are going to want to think a little bit about how do we build those opportunities in for our kids in 3 to 5 for that 5th grade MCAS. All right.
Yeah, I agree. You know, just like maybe like parents, for example, as you said earlier, never have been trained in any of this because they're older, because things have changed, are going to look at results and then they don't understand perhaps without all this introduction how it all supposed to fit together. And so unless they're really tightly coupled, the student's performance could reflect negatively on all the good work, even though we know we're sending them in the right direction because they can't handle the way it's tested for.
Yeah, and that is one thing. So I'm going to go a little bit into the curriculum tool piece. But I will say this is one conversation that I'm having with people at the state level, and one thing that we are monitoring really closely, and the state is monitoring closely, which is does OpenSciEd perform as well or better than previous things on data collection, things like the
And then
MCAS.
Suzanne, do we have something scheduled for K through 5 now that we're getting like upgraded to know what 6 through 8 is doing, like for our kids, like
Our focus is on literacy this year.
for
so-
K through 5?
For K
So
through
we'll
5,
do that at different times.
correct, yeah.
Okay, fine.
So Emily.
Yeah.
We have principals who are coming.
Okay, so let me,
So this is what I might suggest, is do your curriculum tools.
okay, and then just, and then pause there.
Pause, and we'll have you come back.
Oh, okay,
We'll hold on to our slides.
okay, yeah,
That'd be okay?
that's perfectly okay. I
This is
understand.
what happens, we get so interested, we we wish
Well,
we could have done the whole
That's
thing
the
just with
problem,
you,
yeah,
so-
that's the
Yeah.
problem with me in
Yeah.
science is Jody knows.
No, I mean, we're interested too, so I think I'll let you
There
do
we
the
go.
next two slides, if you would.
And then I'll stop.
And then we're gonna have you come back.
All right, sounds great. All right, so curriculum tools. So I'm gonna talk faster than is appropriate because I just wanna make sure we're using time. So in our past practice, everything has been individually created by teachers, which is a ton of work for teachers, especially new teachers, and creates a lot of inconsistency and variability in the level of which it's meeting these goals of the new standards. It is, but the other side of that is there is also a lot of really creative, exciting experiences and projects that teachers are passionate about and have built in to their work, and we don't want to lose that, right? That is good stuff. All of these pictures here are really amazing projects that the students have done, underwater rovers that have been built, indoor gardens that have been built, field work where people are collecting authentic data. So we are, again, have that criteria of both a consistent and a creative and flexible curriculum. So we have both the units, and then if you look at that working scope and sequence documents, you'll see flex time. We've built in time for teachers to have explicit time to do these projects as they are connected to their curriculum. And as we move forward, we are using select OpenSciEd units as the recommended curriculum. Again, this gives them the base. So OpenSciEd is built around these anchoring phenomena. It gives them the tools to do that well with the resources and kind of the sequence of like students building knowledge, here we anchor it, here's the reading of the resource we help to anchor it, students building knowledge, here's the resource we use to anchor it. So building that from scratch, we do have a couple internal units that teachers before OpenSciEd came out built after we did the training on anchoring phenomena. They're amazing. They took tons and tons of work, and doing that at scale is just not something we have the money or the time or the resources to do. So OpenSciEd gives us a tool. It's a tool that meets the Department of Education DESE's definition of high quality instructional materials. Districts really are required is a little strong of a word, but districts are very strongly encouraged to adopt high quality instructional materials. And so this is one that allows us to do that. Again, it gives something for new teachers. They don't have to create from scratch. And then we balanced here, we're going to use this tool with, we want to maintain flexibility and creativity. So we had that flex time. And then in some cases, we're finding that OpenSciEd doesn't fully meet the needs of our students or of our scope and sequence. And in those cases, we have additional resources that we pull in to make the program well-rounded and meet everybody's needs. So,
Good job.
all right, I finished. Do we want to do?
Can
No,
I
it's-
ask a quick question?
So we have 3 minutes of questions. Stephen?
Okay, I'll be really fast. First, I just want to say I really appreciated this this presentation, and I'm really excited about this new curriculum. I in my regular life, I direct a engineering education program, and it just squares with a lot of the trends I'm seeing in the field. And I'm just excited that we're doing it here in Brookline too. My question is just really small and logistical. Do we have a required time on learning for this new science curriculum at any of the levels?
So we are still in the process of completing the middle school review, and so I would say at the middle school level, we have some inconsistency between schools, but we're working really hard to get that to be more consistent.
Okay, thanks. I just want to say again, I'm really excited about this.
Okay, thank you.
So, if there are questions, and there may well be, I mean, especially if you're really into it, like Emily is, you might want to really check out the working scope and sequence with all the framework standards, and so you'll really get a sense of what's being taught when. I would suggest to either jot down your questions and bring them back when Emily comes back. And or maybe you could even send them off to you, right?
No, you're always welcome to email me. I'm happy to talk to anybody who will listen to me about science education.
And that is true. That I could attest to.
Yes.
That she loves to talk about it and she loves to have people who are enthused as well.
Yeah, so I'm happy to answer questions over email, set up a Zoom with anyone who wants to understand more, who wants to like look at like what are those open science resources? How do they actually work in a classroom? Are we sure kids are getting what they're supposed to get? And I will say, if we don't see it in Open Science, then that's when we pull in additional resources, but we make sure that kids are getting what they're supposed to get. That's our job, and we take it seriously, and we want kids to have an awesome science education.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And we'll hold on to this and we'll have
Alright.
that. Okay, we are going to move. Do we, are our,
Yep, they're just walking down the hallway now.
here?
Yes, they're,
Oh.
yeah,
Okay.
literally walking down the hallway.
Okay, I didn't know if they were on. No, Brian is here.
I am. Brian.
Thanks, Betty. You've done an amazing science.
I do, for sure.
Yeah. So you're welcome to stay as long as you want, or.
That's it.
Welcome, everybody. Maybe we should do, just introductions, so we can start, I guess we'll do the table,
Sure.
and then, Dr. Giller, you're in two places.
Being ubiquitous.
Yeah, that's tricky for you to do that. Okay,
Got eyes on the back of the head.
Dave, why don't we just go around and then
Sure.
we'll just point out
Yeah.
the, other school committee members online.
So Gabe McCormick, Senior Director of Teaching and Learning.
Jamie Ida, Pierce Principal. Vanessa Palello, Lawrence Principal.
Jesse Hefter, School Committee.
Michelle Herman, Senior Director for Teaching and Learning. Jody Fortuna, Deputy Superintendent for Teaching and Learning.
Linus Guillory, Superintendent.
Suzanne Fettersville School Committee.
Emily Speck, K-8 Science Curriculum Coordinator.
Brian Venezio, Principal of One.
Betsy,
Betsy Fitzpatrick, Assistant to the School Committee. I
okay.
have folks online.
Helen,
Helen Charlepsky, School Committee.
okay. Carolyn
Carolyn Thal, School Committee.
and Stephen.
Stephen Ehrenberg, School Committee.
Okay, thank you very much. You gonna kick this off?
Yeah, I would love to kick this off.
off.
So one of the celebrations that we have in the district this year is that we had 3 of our middle school programs named the top middle school programs in the state. And 3 of our middle school programs made it into the top 10 of that list. Pierce was number 1, Lawrence was number 5, and Lincoln was number 10 on that list. One of the reasons that I like this particular designation is it didn't rely solely on flat MCAS scores. It looked at MCAS scores in relation to a student's relative socioeconomic level, which is something that we do when we disaggregate our data, and we've noticed that socioeconomic level is an indicator of student performance. And what these 3 schools have done is they've helped narrow that gap between students that may have a lower socioeconomic profile and students that are wealthier. And they did it in a district that is already high achieving with students that perform well. And so it's really a very exciting honor to have had this bestowed upon us. And we've invited the 3 principals here to just have a kind of a roundtable discussion, a Q&A about what's working well at the middle school. Why are we seeing this? So I want to thank the 3 of you for coming tonight.
Thank you for giving up your time, for sure. And, as a school committee, we want to kind of know, what's working, and if you did something different, or maybe not. But so that we know ways that we need to support, either budget or personnel, which is part of budget, or, just what is it that seems to be working well, that we should be aware of? So do we just open it up?
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
open it up.
So, you need more focus on, maybe each one could just spend a moment saying, what lessons you kind of learned and how you think you might have gotten there, and, what's working for you.
Well, I'm obviously the newest principal, so I think Brian and Jamie have more years, but what I will speak to that I think is really important is how hard our educators work. I think this is really a testament to not only our educators, but also our family supports and the relationships, the connections. I do think that, I came to Brookline partially because of the K-8 model. I shared that when I came on board. And I do think that there is something special in terms of our school communities, building and nurturing learners all the way through. And so when we were talking, even prior to this coming out, when I was sharing with my whole staff, the celebrations of MCAS, because we saw really significant, I think, our math and ELA at Lawrence were first in terms of overall proficiency, meeting or exceeding the standards. And so what I was talking about with my whole staff is it really is a celebration K-8. Like, we only get there at 7th and 8th grade and 6th, 7th and 8th grade on building on the foundation that's happened earlier. So even though we're talking specifically about middle schools, I think the combination of having a K-8 model, which allows learners to grow, develop in a school with a community that's supporting them as a learner, is really important to focus on. And then the other thing, and I know we're in a very difficult budget cycle, but I would say the class sizes. Having been a special educator and a middle school educator prior to becoming an administrator working in different districts, the class sizes that my teachers in the middle school are working with, we are blessed with very small class sizes. And when you're talking about differentiating, meeting the needs of all students in a heterogeneous grouping, when you have 20 or 22 or even 23 students, having taught in classrooms with 30 in other districts, that is vastly different. And it allows you to do things, even if you're just thinking about conferencing. So if you're an English teacher or a social studies teacher meeting with students about their writing, or in a math classroom, if I go into Mr. Diley's math classroom in 8th grade, how many points of contact he can have with each child in that room. And we know that teacher conferencing with students, giving them feedback regularly is critical. That is a huge indicator of overall learning outcomes. And you can do that better with lower class sizes. And we are blessed with that right now, for sure. So I would speak to a couple of those things. I think we really have to celebrate the K-8 and what that does for the children. We are blessed with lower class sizes that allow us to differentiate while holding to the heterogeneous groupings that have been a really important part of the philosophy in Brookline. So I'd start that.
Yeah, I do want to echo Vanessa's points about it being kind of a cumulative journey that we go on with kids. And I think in particular, right, the idea of how we deploy intervention and support into our earlier grades so that we are, having students who are able to better access curriculum materials when they hit middle school. I think that's important. I think too, I would echo the class size question. I think the class size point, I think that opportunity for individual attention for multiple touch points, but and check-ins with teachers across a period is really important. I too would come from experiences where I had, as a classroom teacher, 25, 26, 27 students in a classroom, and it's an enormous difference maker to have class sizes that are in that realm of 17, 18, or in some cases lower. I think also, and I don't want in thinking about how this came to be for Lincoln too, I think we have over the last few years in middle school really been looking at our grading practices and thinking about a shift to a standards-based grading process. And I think what that allowed for is more regular and frequent formative feedback for students, and we're shifting their focus from away from digestion and compliance into more about understanding like what skills and standards are you mastering and getting more regular and routine feedback about how that's happening. And what that fostered, I think, was a couple of things, right? I think for students, it was about like what content am I mastering and on what timeline am I doing it? And then I think it also pushed a lot more collaboration among the team where they're talking about, I think, and we talked about the kind of like coherence between some of the skills and standards in science and the way that that touches the ability to like write and make an effective argument in literacy or in social studies, or in particular in 8th grade science when we're talking about working with and representing data. I think the collaboration between our 8th grade math teacher and the 8th grade science teacher really was beneficial in both contexts last year in terms of not only student experience, but also borne out in their performance.
I agree 100%.
I would totally echo the grading practices. I mean, I walked into Lawrence has been using grading for equity and that really is coming out of a standards-based approach. And I will say that our middle schoolers really are able to talk about what is proficiency and talking about what would be beyond the standards. And so that conversation is happening regularly with children. So they understand the expectations in a way that in districts where I think you're more focused on just like a percentage versus what is expected of me on this assessment has been a big part of the shift in our students understanding what's expected. So I echo that part in terms of like standards-based.
Vanessa, why don't you say a little bit too about sort of your data mining pieces that you.
Yep, and we've definitely been looking a lot more at data in general. The assessment practices have been growing over time. I know Jamie also spends a lot of time with her teachers looking at data and looking at student work. So this year, for example, we didn't have examples from DESE in terms of our student work samples for ELA, but last year we did. And we did sit down as middle school teachers looking at our student writing. We did that with our elementary school students too, but really looking at how did they perform last year? Where were they struggling? Again, that's looking at what the state is expecting in terms of a writer at 4th grade versus 7th grade versus 8th grade, and really targeting our practices around the data that we're collecting, because we do have a lot of assessment information on students. And so actually using that in terms of not just here's the data, but then instructionally, what decisions do we have to make to support children, and having those regular conversations about who's struggling and where do we have, maybe not a watch list, but how do we accelerate learning for certain students? That's been regular conversation that's happening, certainly in curriculum planning team meetings across grade levels. But the other advantage we have in middle school is we have 2 CPTs a week or curriculum planning time. So when you're talking about what happens in middle school versus elementary school, our middle school teachers, I'm meeting with them just today. We had 45 minutes with all of them together, and we can differentiate. So we can have grade level specific where we're talking about an individual student, whether they're in social studies or science. This kid is really struggling this week. What's going on? The counselor's sitting and having those conversations. But then we also have cross grade. So Emily might be coming to meet with all of our teachers who are teaching science in the middle school on a CPT. And we have 2 of those a week where they all have that common planning time. That is highly unusual, and it's a wonderful way for us to hit the different needs in middle school, which we do not have in elementary schools in that same way.
No, that was great. You've said so much, and I would echo everything. I don't think there's a point that I would disagree with anything that either Brian or Vanessa said. I guess I would add, to the K-8 piece, our K-5 teachers are generalists, and they are pairing and teaching a lot in a district that has a hard time like really marrying a curriculum. Like we do a lot of them. And that's a lot of work to learn a new curriculum. And so when we get to 6th grade, at least at those of us who have large enough schools where we can do this, our teachers are really specialists in one content area that they are experts in. And that makes a huge, huge difference. And in the case of Pierce right now, our middle school teachers are specialists in one content at one grade level. And that also makes a huge difference. So
our sixth graders have an ELA teacher that has studied the entire history of their MCAS scores by the time she receives them, the second they're out, and also knows all of the MCAS scores of all the kids before, and has already thought about what adjustments she's making in sixth grade curriculum. So using this year as an example, she looked at all of her data and realized that poetry was an area that sixth graders did not score as well as she would have hoped to see. And so she's embedding these micro poetry units in these places where she's got a day or two here or there to build the skills that she knows they're going to need. And what's great about that is, poetry isn't really heavy in the standards in sixth grade, but it's coming, right? They're going to see it again in seventh grade and then again in eighth grade. And so in many ways, that's a much better practice for her than building a whole big poetry unit that derails part of her year. She's fitting it in where it works, and it works really authentically in those spaces. She would not be as able to do that if she were planning for sixth and seventh grade ELA, or for sixth and eighth grade, or for ELA and social studies. So as we're talking about the budget, these numbers are going to come up again and again. But I think if you want to see high performance from students, they need to have specialists for teachers. And I think that needs to start in sixth grade. And if you look at our MCAS data at Pierce over time and you follow students over time, you will see that their growth is very predictable as they move through the years. Their scores are going up, 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 up. And it is again because as they move up, teachers are specializing more and more. So this year I'm excited. One of our teacher teams is piloting in fifth grade a social studies science switch. So one of the teachers teaches science for both sections and the other teacher teaches social studies for both sections. That's something that actually we had years ago. And when we went up to a 5-section grade, the schedule couldn't accommodate it. We were able to bring it back this year with a whole new team of educators. And those kids are going to have a deeper, richer experience because those teachers have more time to plan, prepare materials, trial and error, experiment. So that's really powerful. And then for us, yeah, go ahead.
Can I interject one
Yeah.
thing, just because I don't think everyone who's maybe newer to the school committee knows that you taught middle school in
I
Brookline,
did.
and you have done specialist, you've done
I've done
multi
all,
disciplines.
yeah.
So you
Yeah.
experienced both of those in our actual context.
Yeah, when I started at Pierce, we were a 3-section school, and I was hired to teach seventh grade US history. So that will tell you how long ago it was. That was when we had our 2-year survey course. So I did seventh grade US history, seventh grade ELA, and special education. So those were my 3 classes. And then as our numbers changed and we moved to 4 sections and then 5 sections, I would teach a combination of whatever the history of the day was, the dating of the curriculum, ELA and health. And so I moved through all of those, and I was absolutely a better prepared educator on the years where I taught more of something, right? That last class that had me, I had it down by then. And that's part of why I believe in a rotational schedule as a sort of core thing, because you don't ever want to be the class that always gets the first go at it. That's really hard. Thank you for adding that.
Yeah.
The other thing I think that's important that speaks to Jody's comment about our students with low socioeconomic status is that we did a deep dive of our MCAS data, so 2 years ago, because that's what generated this particular outcome. And of the 19 students who scored not meeting on math and ELA, 18 of them were low income. Now, they also all fit into some other subgroup, so they were also all considered high needs. And we provided really targeted, thoughtful, not terribly hard to execute because we didn't have a lot of resources, focus and conversation about those students with their entire teaching team. And in many ways, I think one of the gifts of Brookline and its small class sizes and its K-8 model is that we're not talking about a lot of kids across would have been 4th through 8th grade. So we're talking about a handful of kids at each grade level. And teachers were really able to give that kid a lot of thought. And even if that thought didn't translate into a ton of action steps, having that child always in the front of your brain changes outcomes. Like, we know that when you are constantly watching a student, thinking about them, paying attention to where they're confused, able to swoop in right away because you see it, oh, this kid's losing the thread, and get them right back on track, you're going to get better outcomes. And I think that's a large part of what we saw. And then transparently, I think, I feel very privileged to lead a school where teachers have very high expectations of students. Sometimes that's annoying for them, for their parents, and for me, but they have very high standards for their students. They push their kids past the low bar that whatever the curriculum sets is setting. They demand discourse, they demand critical thinking, they demand writing and rewriting again and rewriting again. And these children, you may as well pluck their fingernails out. That's how tortured they feel. But that's how we learn, right? We learn by making mistakes and going at it again, and making mistakes and going at it again. And when you have care and committed teachers who believe that children can reach that bar and are willing to pull whatever they need together to make that work, then you get better outcomes. And so I think for us, it's the perfect storm at Pierce this year in the best possible way. Perfect hatch.
Jamie, talk a little bit then about how that translated into sort of the after school support as well as sort of your recess academies.
Yeah. So we worked really, really hard to match students with whatever supports we could find, given the budget and the staff. So transparently, I had more money to spend on homework club last year than I could find to staff it. It just doesn't pay as much for after school work as other after school work that teachers can do. And so if the pay for after school work doesn't cover the cost of childcare for the teacher who's doing the work, you're gonna have a little mismatch there. But we had some before school targeted math enrichment activities and practice. We had during the day, we really leveraged our literacy and math specialists to throw everything we had at kids. And then after school, we were able to provide some support. This year, I actually took on an intern through the Northeastern Public Health major. It's not a co-op, it's an internship, it's different. We don't pay anything for it, it's free. It just costs me time. But I've really trained her up and she's working this year with some of our kids, both during school and after school. So she's able to spend time in the classroom with students and then after school provide one-on-one and small group support. In this sort of environment, schools are very unpredictable in a lot of ways from year to year. You may have the money, but not the staff. You may have the staff, but not the money. It's hard, but you sort of have to look at the pool of resources and sort of poke around and see what you can pull together. And so I think for us, it's about flexibility. The model we've built this year is in many ways very different than the model we built last year. Our morning math has actually expanded, which is great. The teachers are really excited about that. But then I've had a harder time finding lower grade homework club staff, but better results with upper grade homework club staff. So, we're putting the resources we can find where we can with an eye toward the kids who we know need them most. And I think that's the key is, having enough time, enough focused energy and enough data to really know who needs to just be lifted along a little bit more, that little bit extra to help them grow faster than they otherwise would. It's about not letting kids fall through the cracks and continuing to look at the data, look at the student work, ask the questions. I'm grateful that today a teacher reached out and said, hey, there's a kid on my not meeting list. I'm worried. What I'm doing isn't working. We had a 20-minute Zoom because I'm always in the wrong building at the wrong time. So we had a 20-minute Zoom. We had 3 action steps. We've reached out to all the people and we're going to try it and we're going to see where that leads us by the end of January. And I think that building that culture where teachers are not afraid to say, this kid is struggling in my care matters a lot too. I think, that's a hard thing for any professional to say this is hard, I need help. And I think Brookline teachers feel supported by their building leaders and that helps too, because then they know where they can go with help.
I mean, since this is school committee, and we're talking money, I would echo the homework club, like some of these stipends and other things, they really do go a long way. We also made a shift in our practices prior to my time at Lawrence. It had been kind of a free for all. Anybody could come to homework club. We did make that shift looking at the data as Landis was talking about the kids we really needed to focus that attention on and made it an invitation only homework club. So that it could be much more targeted. I think that's really important. The other data we spent a lot of time on last year and then a lot of energy. And this is where I really want to give a shout out to our counselors because kids have to feel like they belong. Mm-hmm. And when you look at our data from Panorama in terms of social, where families are, socioeconomically, recognizing that some of those students struggle to come to school, attendance is a real concern. And so we started having a lot of regular conversations about attendance and what do we do collaboratively as a team. And that includes our clinical team, our administration, bringing in the families, partnering with our families around attendance, because there is a direct correlation to students attending school regularly and then being able to perform. And so for those students where we're looking at socioeconomic status as being a flag, you also often see attendance. And so having attendance conversations, what are we going to do? What kind of plan can we put into place to support a family to get children to school regularly? Because that is a huge factor in success.
Yeah.
So I would say that, I mean, like we saw that in our DESE data that at Lawrence last year, we made a lot of gains in what the state was setting for us in terms of attendance. And I've seen that in Dr. Dubois' presentation too, but that makes a big difference. Kids have to come to school to learn.
And I'll add the trusted adult piece. I really appreciate that component of our panorama data. And we're a STEP school, so we have steps, staff, all three of us are.
Yes.
And so that's huge because what we do, and I suspect other schools have a similar practice, is we look at all the no's, like, no, I don't have a trusted adult at school. And when I say we all, I mean like we all, the secretaries, the building aides, Steps to Success, METCO, guidance counselors, administrators, like we all sit down and we agree, okay, who are we gonna go be besties with? Like everybody gets the best. And like, that's your job. You figure out who that kid is and you find the person, the nurse. Like there's always somebody in the school who's like, oh, that kid doesn't love me. Oh, I can fix that. Yeah, right? Like, and so having that data and then having the support of Steps for us is really helpful. AHU is a great opportunity for after school programming for students. But also having the METCO advisor in the building. If I have a kid who's fooling around and not doing the thing that they need to do, I can text Deshaun and be like, hey, I need you to go sit in this class and get this kid back on track. And he has a relationship with that student, with that student's family, and with our staff. So he's the bridge that's literally in the building all day, or the buildings all day.
Yeah.
One building Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and the other building Thursday, Friday. And it makes a big difference. And it's another person for kids to lean on, which I think matters a lot. Because as Vanessa said, if you don't feel loved at school, you don't come to school. If you don't come to school, you can't. It's pretty directly.
Excuse me, sorry, can I jump in with a quick question? It's Carolyn. I'm really interested in what you're saying. Can someone tell me what is a STEP school before we go too far away from it?
It's a school that has Steps to Success as programming.
And all the K through 8s don't?
No, so Steps to Success is a partnership between the district, the Steps to Success Inc. nonprofit, and the Brookline Housing Authority.
Yeah.
And only 4 of our K-8 schools have students who live in BHA properties. So we only have Steps to Success at Lincoln, Lawrence, Ruffin Ridley, and Pierce because of where BHA properties are located in the attending area, and the high school as well.
Interesting. Thanks. I'm just thinking about all of the truly affordable, with a capital A, housing that's coming, bringing students to the Baker School. I know that's not BHA, but
We met with the Baker team. Actually.
Yeah, and Carolyn, I think, I've been talking to Dr. Guillory about this since coming in there. It's such an important link, but it doesn't start until 3rd or 4th grade. And I've been showing my data for those children, and again, the attendance data, this, especially now that we have a lot more reading data from the additional assessments we're giving. If anything, that's a great partnership, but it starts too late. Like we're catching kids in 3rd and 4th grade. Like we really need to be trying to do more for those children in preschool, kindergarten, and 1st grade to give those families supports, because it is a population that needs as many wraparound services as we can give.
Yep. Thank you so much.
Lance, did you have something for Brian?
Yeah, Brian, I was gonna ask you to talk about what you did, I think, with your writing maybe, and
Yeah, that's, so for a few years, gotta try to figure out how to explain this without going too far down. That's getting rabbit. So, basically sixth grade students in Brookline, they do not have health as a class, and they have world language 3 times a week instead of 5 times a week. So relative to their 7th and 8th grade years, they have 4 fewer blocks a week. We've been through multiple iterations of how best to use that block of time we have with our 6th graders. And for a few years, we've done a dedicated, just because of the way my staffing was, a dedicated like writing class. So 4 days a week, our 6th graders would have a writing class in addition to their ELA class, and it was taught by the same person who was doing their 6th grade ELA. We did that, so the kids who graduated in 8th grade last year had that experience. The kids who were in 7th grade last year had that experience. Last year, we had a 6th block of every academic class in 6th grade. That became the easiest because I no longer had the additional ELA staffing available because of just kind of the size of the building and the size of my middle school cohort and team. So instead we had a 6th block of every academic class. So nobody was like planning anything new, but rather using that as a like spiral block or catch up block, or sometimes like that would be when they would plan like the assessment. So,
We did go to that same model last year when I came in as well, that 6th block, and it's been very helpful for additional time.
Yeah, we've also done various iterations of solving that 6th grade scheduling conundrum. And interestingly, years ago, we had that 6th block and it didn't work well for that team. But the team has sort of been reborn, the staffing turnover. And so at the end of last year, they asked to go back to that model. And so we're doing it again this year. Everybody's obsessed and loves it. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that data goes, but it does speak to the nature of schools, which is that the personalities do matter, right? Principal develop personalities always, and the personalities do matter. And so if a team isn't giving positive feedback about how something in the schedule is working, for me, it really matters that I listen to that feedback and I think about where it's coming from, and I try to adjust the schedule to meet the needs of the adults while also meeting the needs of the children, because it does not matter how beautifully I build a schedule for children. If the adults aren't on board, it's not going to work. And so being really responsive to the schedule itself, to the staffing itself, to the student needs themselves, and then to the teacher needs, it's a constant juggle. So I guess I would say I would caution this broader committee to just be mindful of the fact that the conditions in each of our schools in any given year are different from one another and are different from how they were last year. And so sometimes we're making an adjustment, as Brian had to do, based on things that have nothing to do with the thing that we're adjusting, but it has to happen. And so just, trusting that we are all really thoughtful about these decisions and are making the best decision we can with the particular pie we have been served in building the schedule for the next year, and knowing that no 2 pies in a row might be the same.
That's totally a good point, because most districts, you don't have middle schools having to change their schedule every single year. And that is one of the tasks that all 8 of us have to do every single year, because we have shifting number of sections. And so that is highly unusual. Most middle schools, you're running 8 classrooms at a grade level or something, and it's always that many classrooms. Whereas, we shift. And so that means we have to look at the FTEs that we've been given and create a whole new schedule every single summer. And it's a massive challenge. And that's part of being a K-8 school with less sections. So the good comes with some real challenges that evolve every single year that we try to solve in the best way we can with the personnel we have and their strengths.
Stephen, you have a question, comment?
Yeah, thank you, Suzanne. First, thank you, Suzanne and Jody, for docketing this. This is a really interesting discussion and totally unique for this subcommittee. So just kudos to you guys for having this idea. My question is, I guess I just want to ask for more bragging. I'm wondering if there's anything that you did to turn anything around. Like, we don't win these placements every year, but we did this year. So I'm wondering if there's anything in particular that you did as building leaders to make a change or to identify a problem and implement a solution. I mean, I'm hearing these discussions of what sound like really smart practices and ingredients of really good schools. And it's really thought provoking and it's really interesting to me. But it doesn't answer the question of why we won this year and not last year, and not the year before that, not the year before that. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you did to make a change that brought the school into a higher level over the past year.
Well, I would say that there's definitely, I mean, you hear this theme of data. I mean, I know I came in at the same time as Jody and early on saying to Dr. Guillory and Dr. Fortuna and Michelle, you know, it was surprising that there wasn't a lot of conversations about assessment and data, but I would say that that is growing much more. Like we're talking more about students and what information we have and problem solving that. And so, I mean, I heard that same thread from all three of us that we are having more and more of those conversations. And I don't think that that was necessarily something that was always done in Brookline, but I feel like that is something that is shifting. There's a lot more willingness to talk about, yeah, we need to look at a kid and dissect. And we have all sorts of data. We've talked about panorama data here. We now have STAR data. We have data from our early reading screeners with Dibbles. And so we have a lot more assessment data to work with. And it's taking all of that information. And those are conversations that are happening more and more regularly. So I would say that common planning time, which at least I felt coming in was very much planning time, like sitting and talking about who's going to do what when, is now we're making that shift into what would be a true professional learning community. And again, I feel like at middle school with those 2 blocks and more regular time built in than our elementary do, we do that more. So if you're asking about like, what is one of those differences, that is a real difference. It was already in place, but we're doing more and more of that.
That's fascinating. And you feel like that's already making itself felt as a shift on the ground. It's not just a change in practices behind the scenes, but it's already affecting like learning outcomes. It's already affecting student culture.
I think so. I think the grading practices we're building, like Brian was talking about, this focus on really thinking about students understanding standards. What is expected of me? What is 7th grade writing look like? That shift was starting, but then you couple that with now teachers really examining data and saying, what do I know about these learners sitting in front of me? And how do I take that to help channel it? And again, it's all kinds of data. It's that social emotional data. It's that attendance data. It's that data on what their writing scores look like and where they need to go.
Thanks. That's fascinating.
Jamie or Brian, do you have something else? With that question?
No, I mean, the change for us did come, I think, in like the implementation of a standards-based approach to grading. And I think that it isn't that in and of itself, but rather what comes with it, right? Which is the more regular look at formative assessment data and more regular feedback to students about what they're mastering and how. So.
And for us, I would say it really was the turning point for us was the focused action plans for students. Like I think about one particular classroom last year in 5th grade that had a couple of students who had action plans. And, you know, when I say action plan, it sounds big and scary, but this particular action plan was like so lovely. So the teacher noticed in the opening months of school that these 2 students were very passive in class, like we're afraid to take a risk, we're afraid to raise their hand, we're afraid to ask a question or to answer a question. And so she built a plan where each time they sort of voluntarily put themselves out there, they earned a sticker. And at the end of this, which they self-monitored, and at the end of completing a row of stickers, they got like a fancier sticker. So like 10 little stickers equaled 1 big sticker. And the page held 10 rows. So once they got 100 like points, as it were, they were able to exchange that for an incentive of their choosing, which adorably was spending time with me, which was a win for me. Yay. But what was super interesting was that even though she was focusing on that for those 2 students, whenever a teacher is focusing on improving a practice, it trickles out to everybody else. So if you look at the student growth percentiles in her class, they're like nothing I've ever seen before. Like 80 some odd % of her students had a high SGP in that class, like 60 or above. It was wild. I have not seen it before. I did not see it in any other classroom last year. But she picked a practice that increased engagement for every single student in her room. And so, you know, I had another teacher, my 7th grade math teacher built these action plans for, she had a whole bunch of kids. And each action plan was very targeted to a student behavior. So like one student kept signing out. Well, you can't learn math if you're not fitting in math. And so she would stand with a stopwatch and be like, you have to be faster today than you were yesterday, because he was signing out all the time. And what do you know? When you sign out less, you learn more math. What a strange idea, right? And so another student like didn't see themselves as a math thinker. And so every day at the end of class, that student had to share with that teacher something they were proud of that they had done that day in math, whether it was persisting on a problem or asking a question or speaking up in a group. And that student had an SGP in the 90s, right? So, you know, these are very small practices that make huge differences for kids. And what it comes down to is the teachers have to know their students. So when I say, what did we do differently? I wouldn't say we did anything differently. We did something with a little more focus than we did in a prior year. And for whatever reason, that focus worked really well. Now, I'm a believer in patterns, like once is a coincidence. So I want to see, forget the rankings, but I want to see the high SGPs for these same students replicate this year, because new teachers have now received them, have the benefit of the information from prior teachers and prior plans, and are taking this new unique human who is 180 days of school different than they were last year when the plan was made, and building a plan that works for that teacher, works for that student, and that meets that student where they are, and then let's see how far they grow. And I think that's the sort of magic of education, is that part of why it isn't perfectly replicable, and part of why you can't predict why this year and not last year, or why this year and not next year, is the humans are different every year. Even the same human is different, right? If they're not, we're doing something wrong. They should be better, new and improved each day, right? And so, you know, I understand the reason for the question, Stephen, but I think that what it comes down to is that, you know, we are a district of educators that are really caring and committed, and helping our educators not feel burned out, helping our educators feel like they're getting their needs met, maybe dating fewer curriculums and marrying some, like really making sure that the materials they have make sense, that they're well trained on them. That's all going to continue to make a positive difference for our students, because the teacher should be spending time on the kid. That's the place you want them to be investing.
I think
Thanks so much.
I think what's worth highlighting too is, Jamie, the interventions you talk about are incredibly small.
Correct.
These are not massive life-changing things for the teacher or the student,
Correct.
and yet the impact is huge.
Not even enormously expensive.
Right.
There's a time.
There's a time you structure people.
Yeah.
And your teacher needs to have, I mean, speaking back to that small class size, like those class sizes that did the best were the smallest classes, right?
Yeah.
And that's because the teacher was able in a class of 18 to focus
Yeah.
really intently on getting to know 2, and then to building a plan that could be monitored and checked back in on multiple times. I think you can't do that in a class of 25 or 30. And so to that extent, there is a resource. It's just one we've already spent.
Right. So it's about that time, and I really want to thank you for being here. I also want to say that I know we invited the 3 of you, but all of our programs actually doing quite well. So I don't want to make people feel like you're the stars, but you've got many others.
It's a whole constellation of it.
Yeah, the whole constellation, exactly. The whole constellation. So, but thank you so much. I do thank you for giving up your time on this late evening. It's so dark. So, and we just love when we come and visit and we hear some of this. So maybe we can do it again in the spring. I know it's a bit of a burden, but I think it really helps us to to make connections and to know what it is you're talking about.
They're just little interventions when we come to visit.
There you go. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Time for questions.
Uh,
Bye. Just
Was there
saying
one
bye.
question?
These are
thank you very much. Our last item here is new business. We have new business today. Saying that, just going to suggest we adjourn. So thank you very much. Thank you to OTL and the team. And everybody have a good evening. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, principals, so much. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.